The low hum of the desktop was the only sound in my office. Scott Miller's face flickered on the screen, frozen mid-grimace. It was a good look on him, I thought. Much better than the confident smirk he'd worn for most of his life. My finger hovered over the send button for the third time, but I pulled it back. No, I wanted him to stew a little longer, to truly understand the clock ticking. I checked the time on the lower right of the monitor. 9:47 p.m. Still a few hours until midnight. I leaned back, the old office chair creaking softly beneath my weight. Outside, the night was cold and clear, the kind of stillness that settled over the Midwest in late fall. My gaze drifted to the framed photo on my desk, Sarah and me smiling, a hiking trail winding behind us. The memory of that picture, of a simpler time, faded as another image pushed through. Scott's face not on a screen but in person, under the bright lights of a hotel ballroom, 3 months earlier. The Harvard Law 15-year reunion. Sarah had been the one to push for it. "It's good to see old faces, Mark," she said, smoothing the lapel of my jacket that evening. "Networking, or just catching up. You're still young, you need to stay connected." She always had a way of making it sound practical, even when she knew I'd rather spend a Friday night reading zoning permits. I'd gone, if only to stop her gentle prodding. The ballroom was a sea of expensive suits and polite laughter. The air smelled of overpriced appetizers and ambition. I felt the familiar weight of being out of place, a public interest lawyer specializing in environmental law, surrounded by corporate titans. My conversations felt smaller, my victories less tangible. I managed a brief, awkward catch-up with Ben Lee, an old study partner, now a partner at a firm that handled international mergers. He looked tired, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. We exchanged pleasantries, the easy camaraderie of our student days replaced by the strained politeness of two men who had chosen very different paths. Then Scott Miller walked in. He moved through the room like he owned it, which in a way he did. The golden boy of our class turned Wall Street legend. He specialized in hostile takeovers, acquiring struggling industrial companies, stripping their assets, and leaving behind a trail of layoffs and environmental wreckage. He held court near the bar, a practiced smile on his face, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, his eyes scanning the room, always calculating. His gaze landed on me. The smile didn't falter, but something cold glinted in his eyes. He broke away from his cluster of admirers, walking with an almost predatory grace. "Mark Jensen," he drawled, stopping a few feet away, close enough for me to smell the expensive cologne. "Still saving the world one tree at a time, are we?" The humor in his voice was thin, a barely concealed jab. Sarah, standing beside me, offered a tight smile, sensing the shift in the air. Scott turned to Sarah then, a quick, appraising glance. "Sarah, you look stunning. That dress is perfect on you." His voice was smoother, but I saw the slight flinch in Sarah's own eyes, a recognition of the insincerity. He turned back to me, the smile widening, revealing too many teeth. "Mark here, he's a regular Don Quixote, isn't he? Fighting windmills while the rest of us are out there building wind farms, or at least buying the companies that make the parts." He chuckled, and a few of our former classmates who had gathered nearby chuckled with him. The conversation had shifted. It was no longer a reunion catch-up, but a performance for Scott. He leaned in conspiratorially, but his voice carried. "Honestly, Mark, I made more money last quarter than you'll see in your lifetime. I could buy your entire forest and turn it into a golf course before you finish your next appeal." He punctuated the sentence with a mirthless grin. Something inside me tightened. I felt the heat rising in my neck. "And how many communities have you poisoned to make that money?" "Scott," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my gut. The laughter died, replaced by a sudden, awkward silence. Scott's face hardened. The casual charm evaporated, replaced by a cold, reptilian stare. "That's why I have a 9-figure net worth," he said, his voice flat. "And you are still driving what is it? A Subaru." He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving mine. It was a dismissal, a pronouncement of my place in his world. Sarah put a hand on my arm, a silent plea. We left shortly after, the taste of cheap triumph in the air. In the car, Sarah tried to comfort me, her words a soft hum against the roar of the engine. He's just insecure, Mark. Don't let him get to you. But the sting of his words was real, a bitter pill that lodged in my throat. I felt the truth of his dismissal, a cold, hard fact. That night, lying awake, I stared at the ceiling, the glow of the digital clock, a constant reminder of the time passing, of the chasm between us. Something had hardened inside me, a quiet resolve. I wouldn't let Scott Miller define me. If fate or sheer will ever gave me a chance to tip the scales, I wouldn't hesitate. 3 weeks later, the sting of the reunion had dulled, replaced by the familiar grind of my work. The air in my Pittsburgh office was thick with the smell of old paper and lukewarm coffee. The late morning light struggled to penetrate the grime on the windows, casting a dull glow on the stack of environmental impact reports piled on my desk. That's when Maria Sanchez walked in. She was in her early 60s, her face etched with the kind of lines that came from hard work and worry. Her hands, when she laid them on my desk, were calloused, her nails clean but worn. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. Jensen," she began, her voice steady, betraying a quiet determination. "I'm from Oak Haven." Oak Haven. The name conjured images of forgotten towns, nestled deep in the Rust Belt, slowly fading with the industries that once sustained them. Maria confirmed my unspoken thoughts. "Our town, it's been dying, Mr. Jensen, ever since Keystone Manufacturing shut down." Keystone had been the lifeblood of Oak Haven, a factory that had churned out metal components for generations, only to close its doors years ago, leaving behind a skeletal structure and, as I suspected, an environmental time bomb. Now, Maria continued, a company called Horizon Industrial Partners bought the old plant. They're promising jobs, revitalization. Mayor Dave Thompson and the council, they're falling all over themselves, handing out permits and tax breaks like candy. There was a weariness in her voice, but also a sharp edge of suspicion. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. "But you don't trust them," I stated, more a confirmation than a question. Maria's eyes, a deep, troubled brown, flashed with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "My husband, Mateo, he worked at Keystone for 30 years, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "He died of lung cancer. The doctor said it was the dust, the chemicals he breathed in every day. They never cleaned up the old factory properly when it closed. Never." She looked directly at me, her gaze unwavering. "Now these Horizon people, they want to start production again. I hear they're bringing in the same old equipment. Not upgrading, not cleaning, just kicking up the same old poisons." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "No, Mr. Jensen, I don't trust them." She reached into a worn canvas bag and pulled out a glossy brochure. "Horizon Industrial Partners," it proclaimed in bold, modern lettering. "They gave these out at the town hall meeting," she said, pushing it across the desk. I picked it up, my fingers brushing against the slick paper. My eyes scanned the text, then landed on the smiling face on the cover. A face I knew too well. Scott Miller. My heart skipped a beat, a cold, hard thump against my ribs. I felt a sudden electric jolt, a surge of adrenaline. The air in the office suddenly felt thinner. "Horizon," Maria clarified, watching my reaction with a quiet intensity, "is a subsidiary of Miller Capital." It was a strange feeling, like a trap door opening beneath my feet, only to reveal not a fall, but a path. A path directly to Scott Miller. This wasn't just any case anymore. This was personal. The humiliation at the reunion, the casual cruelty of his words, it all clicked into place. This wasn't just about environmental law or helping a struggling town. This was about something else entirely. I closed the brochure, placing it carefully on my desk. "I'll take the case, Maria," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside me. "And don't worry about the initial payment. We can sort that out later." I needed to get to Oak Haven, to see it for myself, to confront this new opportunity head on. I called Sarah from my office phone, the familiar digits a small comfort. "Hey," I said, trying for a casual tone, but knowing she'd hear the underlying tension. "That tone," she said, her voice warm, but with a knowing edge. "This wouldn't happen to have anything to do with a certain arrogant financier who shall remain nameless, would it?" I paused, a wry smile playing on my lips. She knew me too well. I've just taken on a new client, I admitted. A town called Oakhaven. Turns out Miller Capital is involved. There was a moment of silence on her end, then a sigh. Just be careful, Mark, she warned, her voice serious now. Don't let this become about your ego instead of their needs. These are real people, remember? I know, Sarah, I said, and I meant it. Mostly. But even as I said the words, a deep, satisfying hum resonated within me. The prospect of derailing Scott Miller's plans, of turning his carefully constructed empire against him, felt like a promise whispered in the dark. The drive to Oakhaven took nearly 2 hours, the landscape slowly shifting from urban sprawl to rolling hills, then to the worn-out industrial towns dotting the river valleys. When I finally arrived, the old Keystone manufacturing plant loomed against the gray autumn sky, a sprawling, dilapidated behemoth of brick and rusted metal. It was even worse than Maria had described, and she hadn't been wrong about Scott's haste. Even from the main road, I could see figures moving around the loading docks, forklifts rumbling, the unmistakable signs of activity. Scott wasn't wasting time. He never did. The diner was warm, smelling of stale coffee and fried food, a comforting scent that spoke of routine and long-held habits. About 20 people gathered in the back room, their face etched with a common anxiety. They were mostly older residents, their eyes carrying the weariness of lives spent in a town that had seen better days. Many had worked at Keystone Manufacturing, or lived close enough to feel its presence, good or bad, throughout their lives. Maria sat beside me, her hand occasionally patting the arm of the woman next to her. Frank Peterson, a man whose hands were gnarled like old tree roots, spoke first. He'd been a shift supervisor at Keystone for over 30 years. Back in 2010, he began, his voice gravelly. The EPA came through, did all kinds of testing, said they found all kinds of nasty stuff in the soil, in the groundwater. Benzene, lead, mercury. Said it was bad. He shook his head, a bitter taste on his tongue. Then nothing happened. They wrote up their reports, told us they'd monitor the situation, and that was that. The factory closed a year later. Everyone forgot about the poison. One by one, others shared their stories. A woman named Clara spoke of her brother, who died of an aggressive brain tumor in his late 40s, despite no family history. Another, a retired teacher, recounted a cluster of rare childhood cancers among students living near the plant in the 90s. There were stories of stunted gardens, pets dying mysteriously, and a pervasive, unspoken fear about the water from their taps. The details were anecdotal, heartbreaking, and impossible to ignore. Each story was a piece of the puzzle, laid out raw and unvarnished. They looked at me, their eyes full of questions, hope, and a desperate plea for answers. I spent the next several days holed up in my makeshift office, a rented room above the Oakhaven hardware store, surrounded by mountains of documents. I sifted through historical permits, the barely legible carbon copies of EPA reports from decades past, and the glossy, freshly printed pages of local zoning ordinances. What I found was a familiar pattern of neglect and convenience. Loopholes big enough to drive a truck through peppered the environmental regulations. And the speed with which the town council had approved Horizon's proposals was alarming. It was clear they were more interested in the promise of push than in the environmental costs. My first move was to try for an injunction. I drafted a concise, urgent filing, citing the potential for further contamination and the lack of a comprehensive cleanup plan. But Horizon's legal team was already in place, a well-oiled machine of corporate lawyers flown in from Pittsburgh. They met every argument with a wall of legal jargon, procedural delays, and a casual dismissal of community concerns as unfounded speculation. They argued that restarting production was crucial for Oakhaven's economic revival, and any delay would be catastrophic. The local judge, a man who had likely grown up with many of these residents, but whose livelihood depended on not rocking the boat too hard, was hesitant. The injunction was denied for now. I also met with Mayor Dave Thompson. He was a portly man with a perpetually flushed face and an air of beleaguered authority. We sat in his office, the walls adorned with framed certificates of appreciation and photos of various town events. "Mark," he began, waving a dismissive hand, "I understand your concerns, but we're talking about jobs here. Real jobs. Horizon has promised to bring life back to this town. We can't let a few old reports and some worries about dirt slow that down. He spoke of economic revitalization like a mantra, his eyes glazed over with the vision of prosperity. Environmental concerns to him were a secondary, easily managed inconvenience. Back at the diner, Maria and I sat with the core group of concerned citizens. The denial of the injunction was a setback, but I wouldn't let it be a defeat. We need to hit them where it hurts, I explained, spreading a few legal pads across the table. Legally, they're entrenched right now, but public opinion, that's a different battlefield. We need to make noise. We need to make this impossible for them to ignore. I outlined a strategy focused on collective action and public awareness. We'll organize a town meeting, I proposed, not just for us, but for everyone. We'll present the facts, the stories, the unanswered questions. We'll challenge the council's narrative publicly. We need to rally wider support, show them the unified voice of Oakhaven. Maria nodded slowly, her eyes bright with understanding. As I left that evening, the autumn air was sharp, carrying the scent of damp leaves. The hope in the eyes of those people, the trust they placed in me, was a heavy burden. It wasn't just my reputation on the line, or even just Oakhaven's future. This was a chance to prove something to myself and to Scott Miller. The stakes felt impossibly high, personal in a way I hadn't anticipated. This battle, I realized, was just beginning. The Oakhaven Community Hall buzzed with a nervous energy. Every folding chair was occupied, and people lined the back walls, their faces a mixture of hope and skepticism. The air was thick with expectation. Maria had done an excellent job getting the word out. The crowd was larger than I'd anticipated, a testament to the quiet desperation simmering beneath the town's surface. Maria Sanchez stood first, her voice clear and strong despite the tremor in her hands. She spoke of Mateo, her husband, his 30 years at Keystone, the persistent cough that turned into a terminal diagnosis. He worked hard, she said, her voice cracking slightly. He believed in this town. But what did it give him? A slow death. Other residents followed, their stories weaving a painful tapestry of illness and loss. Frank Peterson spoke of friends whose lives were cut short, of the strange ailments that plagued families living closest to the plant. The raw emotion was palpable, a heavy weight in the room. When it was my turn, I tried to keep my presentation factual, letting the numbers and reports speak for themselves. I laid out the historical EPA findings, the elevated levels of contaminants. I detailed the startling speed of Horizon's permit approvals, highlighting the areas where due diligence seemed to have been overlooked. This isn't about stopping progress, I concluded, looking out at the anxious faces. This is about ensuring that progress doesn't come at the cost of Oakhaven's health. Horizon Industrial Partners had sent their own delegation. A slick-haired man in an expensive suit, their chief legal counsel, sat beside a woman from their PR team, her smile practiced and unyielding. They took the stage after me, seamlessly transitioning into their narrative. The lawyer, a man named Henderson, smoothly dismissed the anecdotal evidence, highlighting the old age of the EPA reports. The PR woman spoke of a new clean era for Oakhaven, showcasing computer renderings of a modernized factory, complete with green spaces and solar panels. They promised state-of-the-art filtration systems, job training programs, and a revitalized economy. Their message was clear. Fear was unfounded, and only Horizon offered a path forward. Mayor Dave Thompson, taking the podium next, solidified his allegiance. "We appreciate Mr. Jensen's concerns," he began, his voice strained, "but we have to be realistic. This town needs jobs. Our children are leaving. Horizon Industrial Partners is offering us a future. We can't let unfounded fears stand in the way of economic growth." The crowd murmured, a division evident. Some clapped politely for the mayor, their desperation for jobs outweighing their environmental fears. Others remained silent, their faces grim. The fallout was swift and unpleasant. Local media coverage was mixed. The larger regional papers picked up the story, some framing it as a David versus Goliath battle for environmental justice. But the small-town Oakhaven Gazette ran an editorial that painted me as an outsider, an environmental crusader interfering with Oakhaven's recovery, a job killer who didn't understand the realities of a struggling Rust Belt town. Then came the more insidious attacks. My office started receiving anonymous emails and phone calls, not overtly threatening, but unsettling. Whispers about my professional conduct, about unethical practices began to surface online in anonymous forums. Someone was trying to smear my reputation. The day I found my car with its brake lines subtly tampered with, the lug nuts on one wheel loosened just enough to be dangerous but not immediately obvious, the message became chillingly clear. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. Someone was watching me. Someone was willing to cross a line. I called Sarah that evening, the news about the car a cold knot in my stomach. She listened patiently, her silence heavier than any words. "Mark," she said finally, her voice laced with a deep concern, "this is getting out of hand. Your safety, this pressure, it's not good for you." I heard the worry in her voice, a fear she usually kept hidden. She was right. I was tired, the relentless pressure eating at the edges of my focus. But the anger, the quiet fury at Scott Miller's tactics burned brighter. This wasn't just about Oak Haven anymore. It was a war, and I wasn't about to back down. The stakes had been raised. I leaned back in my chair, the dim light of my office casting long shadows. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This was going to get a lot dirtier before it got better. The lawsuit I filed was a lean, precise document targeting Horizon Industrial Partners and, by extension, Miller Capital. It alleged environmental negligence, fraudulent inducement, and a host of other charges designed to halt their operations and force a proper cleanup. Filing it felt like stepping into a ring, knowing the opponent was a seasoned heavyweight. Scott Miller's legal team, as expected, hit back with immediate aggressive countermotions. Their strategy was clear: delay, obfuscate, and financially exhaust me. They challenged every discovery request, filed motions to dismiss, and buried us in mountains of irrelevant paperwork. Each maneuver was calculated, a drain on time, resources, and morale. During the discovery process, sifting through the limited information I could pry from them, I started seeing patterns. Horizon wasn't an isolated incident. I found a disturbing history of other acquisitions where corners were cut on environmental compliance, followed by rapid resales before any long-term consequences emerged. More troubling was a complex web of shell corporations, creating layers of ownership designed to obscure true responsibility. And then there was Mayor Dave Thompson. A shell company, barely registered, had purchased a tract of land adjacent to the old Keystone plant just weeks before Horizon's announcement. The owner of that shell company? A distant cousin of Mayor Thompson, who then promptly sold the land at a significant profit to Horizon. The scent of corruption was undeniable. I knew I couldn't fight this alone in a courtroom. I needed another kind of leverage. I thought of Carol Stevens, a seasoned investigative journalist who had made a name for herself exposing local government scandals. She had a reputation for being relentless, meticulous, and unafraid to ruffle feathers. I found her number and called, laying out the basics of Oak Haven's situation. She listened, her voice crisp and no nonsense. "Mayor Thompson, you say?" she mused. "Always liked the smell of that man's dealings." She agreed to start her own discreet inquiry, focusing on Thompson's financial history and Horizon's acquisition process. I sent her everything I had, trusting her instincts. As the weeks turned into months, the legal fees mounted. My modest practice, built on environmental cases often taken pro bono or with deferred payments, wasn't equipped for a fight against a corporate Goliath. My personal savings dwindled. Sarah saw the stress etched on my face, the late nights spent hunched over documents. She never complained, always offering a quiet strength, a cup of coffee, or a gentle touch. "We'll figure it out, Mark," she'd say, her belief in me unwavering, even when my own resolve flickered. Her support was a lifeline. Then an anonymous email arrived. It was brief, cryptic, from an untraceable address. It simply read, "Former Horizon employee, Keystone violations. Look for Smith at the old diner, 10 p.m. Bring cash." A whistleblower. My pulse quickened. This was the break I needed. I arranged the clandestine meeting. The old diner, deserted except for a lone cook wiping down the counter, felt like something out of a bad movie. A nervous man in his late 50s, gaunt and with darting eyes, sat in a back booth. He introduced himself as John Smith, though I suspected it wasn't his real name. He spoke in hushed tones, fear visible in every tremor of his hand as he sipped his lukewarm coffee. He'd been a project manager for Horizon on several sites, including a brief stint at Oakhaven. He was disgusted by what he'd seen. "They cut corners on everything, Mr. Jensen," he whispered, "especially environmental. It was always about the bottom line, fast in, fast out." He pushed a worn folder across the table. "This is everything I could get out," he said, "before they pushed me out." Inside were internal memos, engineering reports with ignored warnings, emails detailing deliberate decisions to use cheaper, less effective cleanup methods, and even directives to obscure environmental data from local regulators. He described how they'd planned to use outdated, leaky machinery from another closed plant at Oakhaven, knowing it would likely exacerbate the existing contamination. The money I handed him felt insignificant compared to the risk he was taking. The evidence confirmed my worst fears. Horizon's plans weren't just careless. They were built on a foundation of deliberate negligence, a cynical disregard for the health of Oakhaven and its people. This wasn't just a threat, it was a ticking time bomb. As the shadows lengthened across Oakhaven, the intricate web of deception began to unravel, exposing the rot beneath the surface. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. The documents John Smith handed me were a bombshell. Stacked on my desk under the stark light of my office lamp, they laid bare Horizon's deliberate pattern of cost-cutting. Page after page detailed how environmental safety protocols were not just ignored, but actively circumvented. Internal memos outlined specific budget cuts for waste disposal, explicitly instructing managers to utilize cheaper, unapproved methods, even when internal assessments warned of significant environmental risks. Engineering reports, stamped confidential, listed equipment deemed faulty or beyond repair that was slated for transfer to the Oakhaven factory, along with plans for using outdated and dangerous waste disposal methods. It was a calculated risk, betting that the regulatory agencies wouldn't look too closely or that any damage could be quickly offloaded before it became public. The most damning pieces were the internal emails. Thread after thread led directly to Scott Miller, not just general directives, but specific approvals for the cost-cutting measures, sometimes with his personal initials at the bottom or an approving SM him in the email chain. He wasn't just a figurehead, he was actively involved in these unethical and illegal practices. The man who had mocked my Subaru was now revealed to be a corporate criminal, risking the health of an entire town for a few extra dollars. Just as I was cataloging this new evidence, Carol Stevens delivered her own punch. Her expose hit the regional papers and quickly spread online. It was a meticulously researched article connecting the dots between Horizon's dubious environmental record, Mayor Dave Thompson's sudden increase in personal wealth, and the suspicious land deal involving his cousin. Carol hadn't just hinted at bribery, she presented enough circumstantial evidence to make it undeniable to anyone reading. The piece was brutal, unflinching, and undeniable. The reaction in Oakhaven was immediate and overwhelming. The whispers of suspicion turned into a roar of outrage. Public opinion, once divided by the desperate need for gauze, swung dramatically. Community support for Maria Sanchez and me surged. Mayor Thompson's office was deluged with calls and protests. Petitions circulated, demanding his resignation and a full investigation. The fear of unemployment was quickly eclipsed by the fear of poisoned water and air, of more lives cut short by corporate greed. The article also caught the attention of the EPA. Armed with Carol's scathing report and my initial legal filings, they took renewed interest. This wasn't just a local issue anymore. It was a federal matter. An official investigation was launched into Horizon's operations in Oakhaven and their historical environmental compliance across other sites. The wheels of a much larger machine had begun to turn. With the whistleblower's documents and Carol's article in hand, I moved swiftly. I filed an amended lawsuit, adding new charges of fraud, racketeering, and gross environmental negligence. Crucially, I requested an immediate and permanent injunction against all work at the Oakhaven factory, citing irrefutable evidence of ongoing environmental danger and a direct threat to public health. Scott Miller's legal team, once so aggressive and impenetrable, was visibly on the defensive. Their counter-motions dwindled, replaced by frantic requests for delays in sealed documents. I heard through the grapevine that their PR team was working overtime, trying to spin the story, but the damage was already done. Miller Capital's stock took a hit. Investors, notorious for their fickle loyalty, began to question Scott's leadership, sensing the long-term liabilities and the growing stain on the company's reputation. The Golden Boy was tarnished. I prepared for the crucial court hearing, feeling a surge of confidence I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. The air in my office felt lighter. The sleepless nights were still there, but now they were fueled by anticipation rather than dread. The tide was finally turning. I saw Scott Miller's face, not frozen on a screen, but in my mind's eye, his usual smirk replaced by something akin to panic. The game was far from over, but I finally had the upper hand. The pressure on him was mounting, a tightening vice that, I hoped, would soon crush his arrogance. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was taken, mostly by Oak Haven residents, their faces a mix of anxiety and quiet hope. Maria Sanchez sat in the front row, her hand clasped tightly with Frank Peterson's. Scott Miller was there too, a rare appearance for him, surrounded by his legal team. He sat ramrod straight, attempting to project an image of calm control, his eyes scanning the room, perhaps looking for any dissent. His usual confident smirk was gone, replaced by a tight, unreadable expression. I presented the evidence methodically. The whistleblower's documents laid out Horizon's deliberate cost-cutting, the ignored safety warnings, the plans for faulty equipment, and dangerous waste disposal. I showed the internal emails, the direct links to Scott Miller's personal directives. Then came Carol Stevens' investigative report detailing the questionable land deals and Mayor Thompson's financial irregularities, painting a damning picture of corruption that extended beyond Horizon. My argument was not just legal, it was deeply personal. I spoke of Mateo, of the other lives lost or forever altered. I spoke of Oak Haven, a town struggling to breathe. I looked directly at Scott Miller, letting the full weight of my gaze land on him. Your opportunities, Mr. Miller, I stated, my voice stirred, cutting through the silence of the courtroom, are built on the broken backs and poisoned lives of people like Maria Sanchez's husband. You saw a struggling town and you saw an easy mark. You saw lives and you saw profit margins. But these aren't numbers, Mr. Miller. These are people. The words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. The judge, a man whose face had remained impassive throughout the proceedings, listened intently. His gaze moved between me, the documents, and finally Scott Miller. He retreated to his chambers for a short, agonizing deliberation. When he returned, the room held its breath. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, the judge announced, his voice clear and resonant, including the compelling testimonies and the internal documentation from Horizon Industrial Partners, the court finds sufficient grounds to issue a temporary injunction. A collective gasp, then a ripple of murmurs, spread through the Oak Haven residents. All work at the Oak Haven factory is to cease immediately. Further, the defendants are ordered to submit a comprehensive environmental remediation plan for the site to be approved by the EPA before any future activity can resume. The gavel came down with a decisive thud. Scott Miller's controlled facade crumbled. The slight tremor in his jaw was visible even from across the room. His eyes, fixed on the judge, burned with a furious, incredulous anger. His legal team exchanged hurried, panicked whispers. His public image, the carefully constructed persona of the Golden Boy financier, was now severely tarnished, not just by allegations, but by a court order. News of the injunction spread like wildfire. By the time I walked out of the courthouse, my phone was buzzing with calls. Oak Haven erupted in celebration. Horns honked, people gathered in the streets, cheers echoing through the small town. It was a small victory, temporary, but deeply significant. It was a moment of justice, a recognition of their suffering. Mayor Dave Thompson, caught in the crosshairs of Carol's reporting and the court's decision, was immediately plunged into a maelstrom. The council announced an ethics investigation into his questionable dealings with Horizon. His political career, it seemed, was effectively over. I felt a profound sense of vindication. It wasn't the end, not by a long shot. There was a long road ahead, a full trial to come, cleanup efforts to monitor, and accountability to demand. But this was a crucial first step, a crack in the seemingly impenetrable wall Scott Miller had built around himself. I called Sarah, my voice thick with emotion I hadn't let myself feel in weeks. "We got the injunction," I said, the words a quiet triumph. She let out a long, relieved sigh on the other end. "I told you, Mark," she said, her voice soft. "You always do the right thing." I knew then that this battle had become about more than just personal revenge against Scott Miller. It was about something deeper, a broader sense of responsibility for the people of Oak Haven, for the future of places like it. The fight would continue, but now it would be on our terms. The injunction hammered Scott Miller. It wasn't just the halted production. It was the financial hemorrhaging, the EPA breathing down his neck, and the public outcry fueled by Carol Stevens' reporting. Facing potential criminal charges for environmental violations, and with Miller Capital's stock plummeting, Scott made one last desperate power play. His lawyers called, offering me a substantial settlement, a sum that would have bought me a comfortable early retirement and silenced Oak Haven for good. The condition was a full withdrawal of the lawsuit and a signed non-disclosure agreement. I refused. My refusal wasn't a moment of dramatic flair. It was a quiet, firm conviction. This wasn't just about the money or about proving myself to Scott. This was about Oak Haven, about Mateo Sanchez and all the others. Justice for them meant more than a payout. It meant a future free from poison. The EPA's investigation continued to escalate, their findings adding to the pressure on Scott. The threat of criminal charges for Miller Capital and its executives became very real. That's when the investors, once so loyal to Scott's Midas touch, began their mass exodus. The news cycles were filled with headlines about Miller Capital's implosion, the once unshakable empire now crumbling under the weight of its own greed. I knew this was my chance to demand true accountability. I leveraged Scott's dire situation, his desperation to avoid prison, and salvage what little remained of his company. My demands were non-negotiable: a full, independently supervised environmental cleanup of the entire Oak Haven factory site, a process that would ensure every trace of contamination was removed, not just masked. And crucially, the establishment of a robust community compensation fund managed by a neutral third party to support the affected families and ensure long-term health monitoring for Oak Haven residents. No NDAs, no silence, full transparency. That's what brought me back to my office, the familiar hum of the desktop in the quiet night. Scott Miller's face, drained of color, filled my screen. He looked older, his shoulders slumped, the arrogant glint gone from his eyes, replaced by a raw, naked fear. His legal team sat beside him, their faces grim, no longer fighting, but capitulating. One by one, he signed the comprehensive agreements I had drafted, each stroke of the pen sealing not just Oak Haven's future, but his own financial and reputational downfall. "How's it feel being powerless?" I asked, my voice flat, devoid of emotion, yet carrying the cold weight of years. I watched him flinch, a spasm of defeated anger crossing his face. I didn't wait for an answer. "No, Scott," I repeated, my voice now firm, clear. "This is justice." I savored the moment, the silence on his end. Then I disconnected the call. 675 words. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking under my weight. The screen went dark, plunging my office into a deeper quiet. The personal cost of this battle had been immense. The relentless stress, the anonymous threats, the strain it had put on Sarah and me. There were days when I wondered if it was worth it, if one man could truly make a difference against such entrenched power. But looking at the framed photo on my desk, the one of Sarah and me, I knew it was. The profound, lasting impact I'd made on Oak Haven, on the lives of Maria Sanchez and her neighbors, was a tangible victory, far more valuable than any personal gain. I was no longer the man solely driven by a quest for revenge, by the sting of a public humiliation. That old wound had healed, replaced by something deeper, more meaningful. I had found a path to justice that extended beyond myself, a purpose rooted in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Outside, the Pennsylvania hills rose in silent testament to resilience. There would be other battles, other towns, other Scots. I knew now that I was ready for them. I had gained not just a victory, but a renewed ethical purpose, ready to continue fighting for what was right. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking under my weight. The screen went dark, plunging my office into a deeper quiet. The personal cost of this battle had been immense. The relentless stress, the anonymous threats, the strain it had put on Sarah and me. There were days when I wondered if it was worth it, if one man could truly make a difference against such entrenched power. But looking at the framed photo on my desk, the one of Sarah and me, I knew it was. The profound, lasting impact I'd made on Oak Haven, on the lives of Maria Sanchez and her neighbors, was a tangible victory, far more valuable than any personal gain. I was no longer the man solely driven by a quest for revenge, by the sting of a public humiliation. That old wound had healed, replaced by something deeper, more meaningful. I had found a path to justice that extended beyond myself, a purpose rooted in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Outside, the Pennsylvania hills rose in silent testament to resilience. There would be other battles, other towns, other Scots. I knew now that I was ready for them. I had gained not just a victory, but a renewed ethical purpose, ready to continue fighting for what was right.